This is a production of Cornell University.
Weeds, they're bad. Most home gardeners, when they're first putting in their garden, they worry about the insects and they worry about the disease. They don't think about the weeds, and this is what kills them every time, and it frustrates them, and they walk away and they say never again, because they didn't prepare for the weeds that are out there. They didn't think there'd be any weeds out there. It was a turf area. It was growing nice turf. Where did these weeds come from? Well, these weed seeds can stay in the ground for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they're just waiting for the right conditions. And turning that soil over, a little flash of light, that's all they need, and they'll start growing. Weeds are something you need to think about. This is, if you look at very closely here, this is weeds at what they call the white thread stage. So there's nothing that's germinated above the soil surface. But if you dig down into it, you see all these little white roots. So those are all the weeds that have germinated. And this is just the perfect time to just very lightly rake the soil a little bit, because at this stage, they'll be easily killed. Wait 2 weeks, and you're out there chopping them down with a hoe. White thread stage is really a nice time to get out there. What I like to do is put a sheet of clear plastic or a pane of glass on a section of my soil that I just worked up, and that will warm the soil. And then what will happen is the weeds will come up, germinate there first, and when I start to see weeds coming up, green weeds coming up underneath that plastic, I know the rest of the garden is in the white thread stage. And I can very quickly go up and down my row and get some excellent weed control just by doing it at the right time. But of course, the easiest way to go would be to use something like a mulch. It helps to control weeds, as well as helps with evaporation, it helps with diseases. There are some diseases that will be in your soil and will splash up from the soil up to the plant. So this puts a barrier between that. So that helps to control some diseases. We'll reduce compaction. Depending on the type of mulch you're using, if you're using a plastic mulch, it raises the soil temperature. If you're using an organic mulch like straw, it cools the soil, keeps it a little bit cooler. If you're using an organic mulch, turn it in at the end of the year, it adds organic matter. So you've got different materials that you can use. You want to make sure if you're using grass clippings, that you're not using the clippings from a lawn that's been treated for broadleaf weeds. So if you were to do that, you treated the lawn, or your neighbor treated his lawn for dandelions, you cut the grass, you put the grass clippings out there, some of that herbicide will leach down into the soil. Tomatoes are extremely sensitive to it. And a few days after you put this mulch down, what you'd see is the plants start to turn and twist. And that's an indication that there was a broadleaf herbicide in there that was causing that. So know where the grass clippings are coming from. And there's lots of choices that you've got here. Here's just some straw that's been used. For weed control, you're probably looking at a minimum of 3 to 4 inches. Some indication, too, that straw will actually help control some insects. Flea beetles, Colorado potato beetle, interrupts their life cycle. Here's newspapers, and people often ask, is it safe to use the newspaper because of the ink that's in it? 30 years ago, I think it was a problem, but the soybean inks that are out there now isn't a problem. Even the color sections could be used. And it's not the prettiest thing, but what some people will do is they'll use, here we've got some paper bags that were going down, and then they'll use some straw mulch on top of it. The nice thing about that is you don't need that 3 to 5 inch layer of straw if you've got some paper down underneath. You probably can only get by with maybe 1 to 2 inches, and that will make a bale of straw go a lot further because you've already got the barrier. So it covers up the paper that's a little unsightly, but you don't need as much straw when you do that. And then there's lots of different plastics that you can use, lots of different colored plastics that you can use, and some people will swear that a red mulch is going to give you an increase in tomato yield. There's some evidence that might be true, but I haven't seen that consistently. Probably the biggest difference between the colors of the mulch is the darker colors will tend to make the soils warmer, and the lighter colors like white or silver will make the soils somewhat cooler. And if we knew what kind of summer we were going to have, it'd be very easy to tell you what kind of mulch to use. If we have a summer like we did last year or the year before when it's extremely hot, you probably would be better off using sort of a whitish or silvery type of mulch so it doesn't get that hot. But if it's a more typical year, a black plastic mulch will do quite well. And again, it helps to control the disease. The problem with any of the plastic mulches is at the end of the year, you have to pull them up. There's some biodegradable ones that you can use, and you can turn those into the soil at the end of the year. They cost a little bit more. The quality sometimes isn't the best. Sometimes they break down a little bit earlier than you would like. But again, at least with the biodegradable ones, you can just put those into the soil, not have to pick them up and throw them away. Now, the question about using a herbicide, and you'll see preen herbicide in any garden center when you go out there. The problem with using a herbicide in a vegetable garden as compared to a commercial grower. Commercial growers got 150 acres of cabbage, okay? So there are chemicals that they could use on that field that will control the weeds and have no effect on the cabbage. The problem in a vegetable garden is you have cabbage and you've got tomatoes and you've got peppers and you've got melons and you've got carrots and you've got that diversity out there. To find one chemical that's going to be useful to control weeds but not affect those crops can be difficult. So there's a couple of different preen products out there. One contains a chemical called trifluralin, a herbicide that's been around for a long time. It can be used on a wide variety of crops. Some of it could be used before you plant the crops. This material could be used after you transplant. So again, you have to read the label. The problem I've got with preen is they've got several different materials, and it's all sort of called preen herbicide. Well, they've got another material that's organic, and it's corn gluten. And corn gluten is actually a fertilizer, and it helps to control weeds. But the problem is for most gardeners, they might pick it up. They may not realize, do they have the organic one, or do they have the one that contains treflan? They also make one that's used for lawns, also called preen, that kills broadleaf weeds on your lawn. Read the label very carefully to make sure you know what you're getting and that the crops that you've got in your garden are going to be on that label. These have an impact, whether it's corn gluten or trifluralin, on germinating weeds. The weeds are already germinated. It's not going to make any difference out there. And again, what's wrong with my plant? Always a key question to ask, because people are going to bring in crops that are loaded with powders and God knows what they sprayed on it because they saw an insect. They saw blossom end rot, so they sprayed a fungicide and they sprayed an insecticide and they sprayed nutrient foliar materials trying to get it, and they bring it to you and they say, what do you think's wrong with it? You're almost afraid to touch it because you don't know what's been applied. And the key is the identification. Do you really have a pest problem? Sometimes things look alike. In this situation, one of these is a pest of snap beans. One of these is a beneficial. How many people would think that picture on the right is a pest of snap beans? How many people would think the one on the left is the pest of snap beans? The one on the left is the Mexican bean beetle, which will sort of gives a lacy appearance as it chews on bean leaves. The other is the multicolored Asian lady beetle, which some people would feel might be a pest if they've ever been bitten by it or have had their homes invaded by it, but it also eats a tremendous amount of aphids, so it's a beneficial insect. Knowing what you've got and what the problem is the real key in this situation. And my colleague Chris Smart in plant pathology would say there's 3 things you need to do to help reduce disease, whether it's on a farm or whether it's in the garden. Some of these are easier to do in a home garden situation. Plant resistant varieties when possible. It's an easy way. Just about everything that you've got that's a resistant variety in vegetables has been bred using traditional breeding methods. So if you were concerned that they were using some sort of genetically engineered material, that's only going to happen in certain sweet corn varieties. It's only going to happen in certain summer squash varieties. Okay, everything else was traditional breeding. Keep the leaves dry. That's where a trickle irrigation system as compared to overhead watering can help quite a bit. And then you want to remove sick plants or sick leaves as soon as possible. Okay, don't leave them in there because they become a source for other diseases to spread throughout there. Get rid of them. The key is to know if you've got what the problem is as well. Rotate your crops. And by that, we don't want to plant the same crop family in the same space. And it's not going to matter that much in the home garden, maybe as it would on a large commercial acreage, because you're using the shovel, you're walking. It's very easy to sort of cross-contaminate your beds, but it helps. When we talk about not planting the same thing in the same area, that doesn't mean, well, I've had tomatoes here, so next year I'm not going to plant tomatoes there. That's right. But we also want to make sure we don't plant peppers, and we don't plant eggplant, and we don't plant potatoes in that same area because they're all in the same family, have a lot of the same pest problems. So try to move things around as much as possible. The more diverse you've got out there, the more rotation that you do, the fewer problems that you'll have. And what I always like to say is we all make mistakes, whether it's not checking your pH before you plant your radishes or growing zucchini that's the size of a baseball bat and thinking you've really got something there. Or you've got squash vine borer that comes in every year. But if we learn from our mistakes, then we've learned something, and that's something that we can share with other people so they don't have the same mistakes that we do. And I think with that, this part of the talk, we're going to be looking at some ways to save some space in the garden and have some fun with that. And for those of you that are wondering, that is not a cucumber that's been genetically engineered to be that big. It's actually a fake cucumber that I like to bring out to any festivals I go to because it always gets a lot of kids around. Anybody familiar with the square foot gardening that Mel Bartholomew had come up with? This was something really he had a PBS show. He's written lots and lots of books about it. And square foot gardening is just sort of a way to try to save some space in the garden. It's kind of not really a new way, but a different way to look at how to space things out in the garden. The idea of it is you take every patch of garden space you've got and look at it in terms of what you can get out of it in a square foot basis. That's basically what it is. Why do we grow things in nice long rows? Well, it looks kind of nice. But really the reason I think we do that in our gardens is because that's the way a farmer grows it. And a farmer grows it that way because originally he needed rows wide enough to get a horse down, which is why we have the rows out there the way we do. Now, of course, it's wide enough to get tractors and implements down as well. For the most part, we probably don't need to put everything in one long straight row, that we can think about putting it in a square foot pattern. And we also know that if things are uniformly spaced, they probably will produce a better yield than if we just have one long row and 3 feet separating it from the next row. You have it evenly spaced, so everything gets the same amount of space and sunlight. Usually things grow very well. That's why we do it. I know it's a traditional way to plant our garden. What Bartholomew talks about is by using the square foot gardening, you can save a lot of space. And if you use all of his techniques and use the wider beds that he's talking about, you could save maybe 75% of the space. And if you're doing that, that means there's less space for weeds, less weeding that you have to do, because what you're growing out there are the vegetables that you really want. He's talking about using raised beds. So these are permanent beds. You're not walking on those, and that's a great advantage. So again, by using these, the soil stays very easy to work. You really don't need to do any tilling. It's almost a no-till situation because the soil stays very loose. You have a lot of organic matter in it. You're going to amend only the beds. So if you've got limited amounts of compost, you're not spreading it on a 20 by 20 foot garden. You're just putting it on the beds that you've got out there. And the area between the beds, well, you might have some turf that's growing there. You could have mulch that's growing there, but it's not what you're going to be fertilizing or putting lime on or putting organic matter. You're only watering the beds. That will save you some money on water. Bigger yields in a smaller space. Okay, so that's the idea behind it. Here's a 4 by 4 foot garden. And, in that garden, something like probably need about 1 square foot for the cabbage and 1 square foot for the broccoli. But in something like radishes, you could put 4 by 4 radishes, 16 radishes in a square foot, 16 carrots or 12 carrots in a square foot. Do something like that. So it's just trying to maximize the space. And also, what it also helps to do is by diversifying it like that, it makes it much more difficult for pests to move in, as compared to if you have that one long row or something can come in at the end and work its way up. Here, they're going to have to find things. It's a little bit trickier. A lot of insects are finding our vegetables out there by aromas that are being given off and chemicals that are being given off. And here in this little section of garden, you've got probably 5 or 6 different species, all giving off different aromas and chemicals. It's a little bit overwhelming for an insect. The problem is when it's 4 by 4 is being able to conveniently reach out and be able to work in that area that's 2 feet away. And although he's very high on having a 4 foot wide bed, I don't like to go more than 3 foot wide, simply because it's easier for me to work, to get in that middle of a bed that's 3 feet wide as compared to one that's 4 feet wide. The beds could be anything you want in terms of size, whatever convenient for you. 2 to 4 feet wide, 6 to 8 inches deep. It probably doesn't even need to be that deep as well. You don't need to go that deep. The question people always ask is, what type of wood should I use? Well, if you use a treated wood, it'll probably last longer, but there's concerns in terms of the chemicals that are put in that wood to keep it lasting longer. Now, up to 2003, there was a copper arsenate that was used in it. Since 2003, treated wood is treated with a very high level of copper. But what some people will do is they'll use treated wood, sometimes line it with a thick plastic, so that you're not going to get any leaching of any of the copper into the soil. What some people will do is just use regular wood, and maybe they'll have to replace it a little bit more often, but probably not that much more often. You can also buy cedar. It's more expensive, but that would be a natural way to make it last a little bit longer. So you've got some different options. Or if you don't want to use wood for your raised beds, there's other things you could do. Here we've just got some bricks that people used. We've got some cinder blocks, maybe not the most attractive thing, but we've got cinder blocks you can use so you don't have to worry about what it's been treated with in that situation. There's also boxes like this, so the same material that they might make the reusable supermarket bags. Kind of that material that could be used as well. It's porous. You could put that out there. And in this situation, you could even put this out on a parking lot or a driveway. Fill it with really good soil. You're probably going to have to water it relatively often, but the water will come right out through the bottom. What do you need to do if you're using a raised bed in terms of you're putting it out there? Do you need to put anything down to kill whatever grass might be out there, whatever weeds are out there? It sort of depends on what you've got growing there. If you've got a situation where you've got perennial weeds, those will come up to 6 or 8 inches of soil that you put on top of it. But if you've just got turf, sod, grass, you could probably just put the soil right on top of it, and eventually it would kill it. Don't need to worry about it. If you wanted to, you could put some layers of maybe some paper down underneath, and that would help kill anything as well. So again, you want to keep it open so the water can move right down, and eventually the roots will be moving right down nice and deep into the soil, which is what we want them to do. In terms of the soil, if you've got lots of compost that you've made, that's the perfect place to put it. You could grow this in a compost material. Otherwise, you could buy a potting mix and fill that up, or you could buy 1 part peat, 1 part vermiculite, 1 part compost, which is what Bartholomew recommends. You just have to remember that it takes a lot of soil to fill up these raised beds. A 4 by 4 foot plot, so it's 16 square feet, 6 inches deep. It's going to require about 8 cubic feet of soil that you'd have there. I don't really follow Bartholomew's square foot gardening, but I really like the raised beds because I know exactly where my beds are from year to year and what I've planted, and that I think is really helpful. I can put my compost right onto the bed and not spread it out where it's only going to be feeding the weeds. I've got some lawn area that's in between the raised beds, and what I used for a raised bed I think was just a 2 by 6, a regular 2 by 6, 10 or 12 feet long, sort of screwed them together. It's nothing fancy, but it just really marks out my permanent beds, which is what I really like. This gets into a lot of fancy things, but I think the real advantage there is just that sort of raised permanent beds that I'm not walking on it, where the soil's always going to be nice and loose and ready to plant. Now you can take this to the extreme. You can see down here at the bottom, somebody actually made these little wood planters. So here they've got a 3 by 3 and a 4 by 4, so they can get everything perfectly spaced. I guess you could go that way if you wanted to. You could probably just guesstimate as well. And if you're doing the square foot gardening, the same as if you're planting any kind of a garden, think about what's going to be in there all year. So succession planting, the same as in your regular garden, you can do in here. So there's going to be some crops, for example. Lettuce is certainly not something we're going to have out there all year. That's going to be replaced. You could put something else in there, the Swiss chard, spinach, radishes. So all these are things that aren't going to be out there all year. So think about that when you're planting it. You can get a lot of production out of that, okay? So again, the advantage, too, is that it's just the vegetable crop. You're not putting much space in there that you've got to go out and do a lot of weeding in. Watering, sometimes it's hard to use a trickle irrigation in this situation, simply because you'd almost have to run it up and down, snaked up and down through there. So sometimes you're going to be using some kind of overhead irrigation. If you're using overhead irrigation, because you're dealing with a raised bed, here, I think you really want to think about adding 1.5 to 2 inches of water per week, because you think about how intensively you've planted. The advantage of a raised bed this time of year is it drains well, so you can get out there. Okay, the problem with that means that when you're irrigating in the summertime, that water is also draining out. So close to 2 inches of water might be needed when you're dealing with any kind of a raised bed. And that's going to be about 1 to 1.5 gallons per square foot for a week. And like I said, you want to probably do it maybe every 2 or every 3 days, put down a smaller amount to give you that amount on a weekly basis. If you put plastic down, would that help hold it in? It would just run out. The only way you'd be able to keep the water in is if you had the plastic on the bottom and had it lined up on the side. But then what's going to happen is the water's going to build up, and you're going to get this anaerobic, no oxygen area, and the roots are going to die. So you want that drainage. Then you can always think about growing things. If you're limited in space, grow up. If you've got a back fence area, those are always perfect areas to grow any kind of pole beans or something like that and have them grow up on the fence. That area is also a good spot for things like tomatoes, which you can stake. And again, they're not going to be shading anything if it's on that part of the fence. Lots of different ways you can do here. They've just made an A-frame that they're going to be growing some beans up. In that situation on the right, they actually were trying to grow a pumpkin growing upright like that. And it did work. They had actually put something for the pumpkin to sit on, because otherwise it would have been too heavy as it was growing. It would have just broken off the stem. So they actually had it sitting on something. It saved a little space, and it was interesting. Here is just a very simple thing where they're growing pole beans. Now, why would I grow pole beans as compared to growing bush beans? Well, usually for that same area, if I had that area planted just to bush beans, and instead what I did was just sort of created a little trellis, which I should have done a much better job of making it nice and straight across the top. As you can see, I did not plan for that, so it kind of bent in the middle a little. But by growing those beans upright like that, and it was on the northern end of the garden, so it wasn't shading anything, a yield from a pole bean is probably 3 to 5 times what you'd get from a bush bean. A little bit easier to harvest, too. And I like bush beans, some of those Italian Romanos, the older heirlooms, some wonderful taste and flavor that I think sometimes we just don't see in the bush beans. Some of these, usually these upright growing plants like this will give you a higher yield. And again, just some more examples. Cucumbers will actually do quite well. They're not going to get the fruit won't get as heavy as you saw with the pumpkins, so you can grow those up on a trellis. Another nice thing about the trellis is when they're upright like that, they have a tendency, the leaves will dry out, which is what we want. Okay, we don't want the soil to dry out, we want the leaves to dry out, because that will help control diseases. The advantage, for example, one of the advantages of growing tomatoes on stakes or in cages is because by putting them upright instead of just letting them sprawl on the ground, by mid-morning, those leaves are going to dry out after a dew, and it's going to help lower some of the diseases that we've got. This was just a fence. I think we put some broccoli in front of it, and then on the back we just grew some pole beans. And what we had here was we were just using a plastic netting. Typically, you might use that as bird netting to throw over berries or something. We just attached it to the back fence, and then we just planted our beans right in front of it. And you can see we had some broccoli in front of those, took a nice advantage of that back space, which normally wouldn't have had anything on it. And then container gardening, you can put anything in a container. You can make a container out of anything. The key is really that you've got drainage. I just mentioned that before when we were talking about the raised beds. But if you don't have good drainage in the container, you want the water to move out. If the water doesn't move out there, that area just becomes filled and filled with water. Roots can't grow in that. Roots need air. So that's going to be the key. Use buckets, trash cans, crates, milk cartons, plastic bottles, just about anything you can grow as long as you've got some good drainage out there. At the bottom of it, so the soil doesn't come out, what I'd recommend is you could put some gravel. What I do sometimes put a couple of layers of newspaper there, just so it will prevent the soil from coming out. But you want to make sure the water is able to come out. So you don't want to put that on something, on a table that's very valuable unless you've got something under it to protect it, to control that water that's coming out. The soil for containers, similar to what we'd be using if we were doing a raised bed. You can buy potting soils. My goodness, there's so many different types of potting soils that you can find in any store these days. You could use a compost, would probably be okay. And I wouldn't use a garden soil, simply because usually when you use good, rich garden soil, once you take that and put it into a container, it has a tendency to sort of separate out into the sand and the silt and the clay. If you really want to use your garden soil for this, I'd recommend that you add either a lot of organic matter or a lot of sand to it, because you're going to have drainage issues if you're just using pure garden soil out there. Since you have a very limited area for those fruits to grow, they're going to very easily run out of fertilizer and nutrients. When you think about that, if I'm growing something in the soil, well, that root might go down, depending on the crop, it could go down 4 or 5 feet. It might go out 4 or 5 feet. So it's got plenty of area to pull up nutrients. If I'm in a little container, that's all the available nutrients it has. In that situation, you've got to think about adding some nutrients to it. And we recommend about every 2 weeks. Some people will do almost every watering, just a very light concentration of fertilizer, just to keep the nutrients there. And then here you probably don't think of something like this maybe for containers, but they would work. You'd have to put some holes in the bottom of it. Or a container like this, which you think of for storage, but you could actually use this. And they're doing something wrong here, because those plants should be a lot healthier. And you see how the edges of the leaf are kind of yellow? Thinking either two things that could be wrong with that. Most likely, they're killing it with kindness, and they probably put fertilizers that maybe were too much of a fertilizer on there, and so it's like a salt concentration. Usually the first sign of a salt damage, and by salt damage could be a very high level of fertilizer, would be the edges of the leaf will start to yellow and brown. The other possibility would be a potassium deficiency, but probably isn't. So they've got this wonderful container that's got a nice reservoir for water and nutrients in terms of the size of it, but they're doing something wrong in that situation. It's going to have to be corrected. Now, if it's a problem that they put in too much fertilizer, hopefully they put holes at the bottom so they can drain it. The key to get rid of too much or excessive salts and fertilizer would be just to heavily irrigate this and make sure the water just runs out the bottom. And you might want to do that for a good half hour, and that will actually help move out some of the soils, some of the salts from that soil. And then you can see, you can grow just about anything in there. If you're growing something like carrots, you want to make sure you've got a good deep area for those to grow in, because once they hit the bottom of that, you're going to lose that taproot. If it's a long variety and it's growing in a shallow container, once it hits the bottom of that container, the taproot will die back and you get a lot of fibrous roots. You get a beautiful top, but it's probably not what you want with carrots. In this one situation, somebody had a concern that they didn't feel they had enough sunlight, so what they did was they put the plants on wheels and they moved them around the yard, following the sun. Over here on the right side, these are just little plant bags that you can buy. Use them, fold them up at the end of the year, and then reuse them again the following year. You can even wash them, because diseases potentially could stay on there, so you could wash them just to clean that up. This has gotten some press the past couple of years. We had some fun with this, and basically you're using a straw bale as a container to grow a vegetable crop. And I'm going to run through this with you. It's relatively easy to do. And why would you want to do this? Well, if your soil is not very good, or if you have no soil, if you're living in an area and all you've got out there is a driveway or a parking lot, well, you could grow with containers, or you could use something like this. So if space is limited, if you can't bend easily, which sometimes happens as we get older, if you're growing something on a straw bale, it's going to be a couple of feet up off the ground. It's different and fun, and it gets a lot of attention. And it's really a nice thing to do if you've got kids and you want to get them interested in the garden as well. So what we do with a straw bale is we use straw, and we don't use hay. Okay, and there's a difference between the two. A hay bale contains the entire grass plant that's growing. So if I'm growing wheat or rye or barley or whatever, a hay bale is going to contain the entire stalk, including the seed head. Potentially, there's going to be the seeds in there, and they are going to germinate, and that could be a problem, and I'll show you a picture of that. With straw, this is what's created after a crop has been harvested. So the seed head has been picked, and then they go through and they will go in and they'll create these straw bales. Now, that's not to say a straw bale is not going to have weed seeds in it, which certainly could. If they didn't do a very good job in terms of harvesting the rye or the wheat, there could also be some of those in there, but you'll have less chance of having seeds in it. They're relatively light when they're nice and dry, but they're going to get wet. And once the straw bale gets wet, it gets heavy. So in this situation, you want to put the straw bales down where they're going to stay for the season. And then you need to condition the bale, because now you're going to be creating the soil out of the straw bale. And here's how you do that. By conditioning the bale, it takes 10 days. I put that out for the first 3 days. All I do is I soak the bale with water. If I have a 2-gallon watering can, that probably would be enough for one bale. I'm just going to put it on there till the water starts running out the bottom. And I do that on day 1, I do that on day 2, I do that on day 3. For day 4 through 6, what I'll do is go out and sprinkle a half a cup of urea fertilizer, which is a high nitrogen fertilizer, or ammonium sulfate, again, a high nitrogen fertilizer. Or if you want to do organically, you could put on something like blood meal or cottonseed meal or alfalfa meal, which again is nitrogen. Sprinkle that on. If you sprinkle it on, water it in again, just as you did the first 3 days. For days 7 through 9, you're going to take half of the fertilizer that you used each day, put a quarter of a cup of the urea or the blood meal, cottonseed meal, put that on, water it in, same way as you were doing it. And on the 10th day, take a complete fertilizer, something like 10-10-10 or Miracle Grow. So it's not just nitrogen, but it has both nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or a complete organic fertilizer. Put that on the top and water that in. What that does is essentially it creates a mini compost pile in that bale. This is what it looks like over 10 days' time. This is the temperature. If you look at the very bottom with the red, that was where I just took a bale out, I put it outside, and I did nothing to it. I didn't put any water on it, didn't put any fertilizer on it. So essentially the temperatures I was getting, and what I did was I struck thermometers in each of these, and I'd go out in the middle of the day and I'd read what the temperature was. For that red line, just dry bale, all I was essentially getting was the temperature, the air temperature was what was in the bale. Nothing's happening out there. Where we just use some water, a little bit higher temperature. This is degrees Fahrenheit, but still not that much higher over what we had where we didn't do anything. The black line is where we were adding the organic material. I was using blood meal in that situation, which is a relatively high nitrogen material. And you can see that we were getting temperatures about 120 degrees. And if you put your hand in there, you could feel that was pretty hot. And then finally, that top line, the one that's reaching 140 degrees 7 days after we started this, that was where I was using the urea. That's nitrogen that's quickly available. And when you combine nitrogen with the carbon in the straw bale, very available nitrogen like urea, what happens is you're creating the conditions for a feast for the soil microbes. Because the only thing that's been holding them back is they didn't have any nitrogen. By adding the nitrogen, they have a population explosion. They start chewing on that straw. They start breaking that down. And because there's so many of them, it would be like if we put, say, 300 people in this room, it would get pretty hot in here, wouldn't it? Well, think about the billions and billions and billions of microbes that are in this straw bale, because that's why it's getting so hot. And then it starts to come down. It spikes. And as you reach in there, not only will you feel the heat, 10 days later, you actually start sort of like a compost has formed in there. So that's what you have to do to condition the bale to get it ready. So you can do it conventionally with fertilizer or organic fertilizer. Either one would work. You could put compost material in, but I don't think it would make too much of a difference because compost has already gone through the composting process. Once you've conditioned the bale, if you're seeding into it, what you want to do is take some soil or compost and put that right on top at about 1 inch thick and plant your seeds right into that. They'll germinate, the roots will go down into that. There's a lot of moisture that's held in those straw bales, so you don't have to water that much once you get the germination to occur. Using transplants into it, what I like to do is just go in, open it up with my hand or a shovel, put the transplant in, and then put some compost or potting soil around it to cover the roots, and then let it close back up, water it in. It's a relatively simple thing. We have a school garden in Geneva, and we did the straw bales a couple of years ago. It was a lot of fun. The kids had never seen anything like it. I had never seen anything like it. It was the first year I had tried it. I'd read about it. I tried to pretend I was an expert. It worked surprisingly well. What grew well for us, herbs seem to grow leafy herbs grow very well. Flowers grow very well. The one thing that didn't seem to grow that well for us was potatoes. I'm not sure why. Maybe something I did. But just about anything else would grow pretty well in that situation. And then at the end of the year, you could try to get another year out of it. But what I find is that they really just start to break down. It's best probably to either spread it out across your garden, the old bale, or put it in the compost pile and let it rot. And there's some nasturtiums that we had in there. When you're first starting, especially with seeds and transplants, you're going to need to water often to make sure that those roots get established and get down into the bale. Once they get down into the bale, you can turn the bales on sort of a little bit on its side. You'll see the roots will already have gone all the way down. Sometimes they'll even come out the sides. Some people even try planting some like parsley, which does very well. Put some of that on the side of the bale. If it's facing the sun, will do okay. Running a trickle or soaker hose right down the bales work really well for watering as well. If you have a problem with a lot of seeds in there, this is what's going to occur. And I've never really had that bad of a problem with that. I've never had anything that looked quite this bad. But it's relatively, if it's just a few, you can just pull them right out. If it's really bad, what some people will do is just go in with scissors or clippers and clip it that way too. But I think sometimes if you can get that good high heat, that helps that'll help kill some of the seeds, at least the seeds that are within the bale itself. Would there be chemicals? Chances are, if it was a conventional farm, they would have put some sort of herbicide out there. Whether that herbicide would still be present by the time this is harvested so much later, chances are they wouldn't be. But there are some chemicals that are relatively long-lasting. I have not had a problem with it. I haven't seen anything where there was a herbicide that potentially was causing a problem with my plants, that things weren't growing well. Everything seemed to be okay. But it's something you might want to ask in terms of where they're getting the straw from. If you could get a straw from an organic farm, probably be the best way to go. So you wouldn't have that concern at all. And you can see there's lots of things that you can grow out there. And again, it certainly is very different. People will be asking you what you're doing and how you did it. And there's parsley growing there. The only problem with chicken manure is potential salmonella, so you'd have to be concerned about the 120-day thing. But if you were doing that now with a long crop, it should be fine. Chicken manure would probably really heat those bales up quite nicely. It would be just as good as urea. Could the salmonella or E. coli, could that grow inside the plant? And no, it's going to be on the soil, on the surface of the plant. If you were to wash it, if you were to cook it, if you were something, you wouldn't have a problem at all. These potential human pathogens do not get into the plant. They're going to be on the surface of the plant. I don't want to get you alarmed about that because really it's just some common sense. You can avoid any problems out there. The biggest problem we'd see is if you were to use fresh manure a few weeks before you harvest something, because you just wanted to side dress with it. You want to stay away from that. Potato towers, I don't even know how many people would grow potatoes, but if you do, it might be worth something to fool around with. Here what they've done is they've just taken a metal loop, looks like something you would grow a tomato in, looks like a tomato tower. So they'll just put some straw around the outside, put some soil or compost in the middle. With that, they'll put the potato tubers around it. As the potato starts to grow, they water it. As the potato starts to grow, they put in some more soil. Grows a little bit more, they put in some more soil. With the hope is that you're going to get tubers coming off that entire vine as it's growing to the top. I tried doing this past year at the school garden, and it worked okay. But I think the key was, and what I found out later, a lot of it depends on the variety. And if you want to try this, you want to use a variety that is a long season variety, something that gives you a good large-sized potato. And if you go to a garden center to buy tubers, they'll have these out there in terms of how, a short season or a long season. Use the long season ones because it seems to grow better than what you get if you used a short season or smaller potato. Worked okay. It was kind of fun to do. The idea is at the end of the year, you just flip it, turn it over, or open up the metal grate, and the potatoes just fall out. Would sweet potatoes work in this situation? They could potentially work in that situation. I just don't think you're going to get as much of the sweet potato potentially coming off the vine as it's growing up through as you would with the regular potato. But it could work, and that might be something I'll try this year. It certainly would be warmer, and that's what sweet potatoes would like. Do strawberries and put them on the sides of it probably. This is probably not what you want to have. Tires potentially have some contamination in there as well. It looks terrible. Different color, but they're painted tires, so they look nice, don't they? That's not in my yard. Okay, must have been down south, I'm sure. And then here's something that you see commercial growers do this, but there's no reason why a gardener can do this. This is actually growing, in this case, it's tomatoes, in bags of soil. So you go out and you buy a potting mix. Instead of using that potting mix in a raised bed or in a container, you can actually grow the plant in it yourself. Now, why would you do it? If you don't have any access to garden, all you have out there is sidewalk, driveway, parking lot, you can essentially go out and do that. And what they do here is they'll take a bag, larger size bag the better, put some holes in the bottom because you want the drainage. And in this situation, they put 2 tomato plants in that bag. So we've got holes in there, and if you look very closely, you'll also see that there's a trickle irrigation line that's running down through here as well. So there is already there's probably some fertilizer that's been added to that soil. That fertilizer will quickly disappear, so what they're going to do is put fertilizer, soluble fertilizer, through the trickle irrigation line so they can irrigate and they can fertigate while they're doing that. They've also covered the area with a weed cloth, so they're not getting any weeds coming up. So they've got a barrier between that. And here's the tomatoes that are coming up, and they're doing very well. This is in a high tunnel, and actually this was in northern New Jersey, and it worked very well. Something you can do, as long as you have drainage at the bottom and a way to get the irrigation in through the top. The roots are just in that bag. What they did is they put this weed cloth there, and that's porous, so the water can go right through that. And people look at this and say, how can you grow? The root system is so limited. But as long as you're giving it enough water and enough nutrients, you could grow a decent tomato plant probably in something this size. You'd have to be very careful in how you control how much moisture. And for those of you that can't see what I'm showing here, I just held up a soda bottle. But again, you'd have to be putting in the right amount of nutrients and water all the time. With a bag, I probably would use a half-strength Miracle-Gro soluble fertilizer. I would use that at least once a week, and I'd have to irrigate throughout the season as well. Now, they took this, went to the extreme. The following year, they left those bags in, they cut the tomatoes off, they did not pull them out, they just let the roots stay in there and rot, and they planted zucchini squash in it, in those same bags. They're fertilizing through the irrigation system, so they're providing all of that nutrients. If you use 2 bags, it's going to give you a bigger reservoir. There's going to be more nutrients and more water that can be held, so you're going to have a little bit more protection. The more soil you have, the better. With that, I'm going to stop and ask if there's any questions. What we have found, and what some gardeners will do and growers will do, is they'll use something like annual ryegrass. The nice thing about annual ryegrass is it germinates very quickly. The roots tend to be in the top few inches of soil. It doesn't compete very much with the vegetable crop that you're growing. And it actually is a very nice material to use, especially between rows of vegetables. You could actually mix a little bit of white clover seed in it as well, so you could have a mix of the ryegrass and the clover in it. Well, folks have my email address, sr43@Cornell. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer those.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.